representative for Seneca College. Full transparency, you know, in terms of, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about humanizing online environments. Full transparency, I had this beautiful presentation that I put a lot of work into for you all, and I had attended Louisa's workshop a couple of weeks ago about creating PowerPoint presentations that don't overload cognitive load and things like that. I lost the presentation 20 minutes ago. So you can imagine my panic and frustration 20 minutes ago. However, I did have an old presentation that I took 5 minutes to update quickly before this. So that is what I will be bringing to you. It is the same content, it just has a lot of Seneca branding on it and things like that. So so I just wanted to give you a sense of where my headspace is right now. Just to let you know. So I am going to share my screen with you all. I will also let you know that I am not going to be putting my presentation in presentation mode. Often when I give these presentations, people will comment and say, oh, did you forget to do that? And I am actually doing it intentionally because I'm going to be popping in and out of my presentation a lot, and that'll just help with my process. So the first thing I would like you to do is go to Menteecom and answer this question for me. What organization are you part of? You can go to Menteecom by either accessing it through your mobile device or opening a new tab in your browser. And then once you get to Menteecom, you are going to put this code here in order to access the questions I'm going to ask you. So the code is 78529203. So I'll repeat that, 78529203. Or if you have your mobile phone, you can use this QR code as well and just take a photo of it that way. So the question that I am asking you today is, what organization are you part of? So I got that one started for you, Seneca, and if you could use as few words as possible, so the answers will come together and we can see where everyone is coming from and where the majority are coming from. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Okay, so far all colleges, Ontario colleges, I should say. Oh, we've got Queen's University as well. Oh, OCAD University. Okay, I did see the registrations, and there were some registrations from outside of the college sector or higher post-secondary education sector. We have someone from a hospital. Okay. And I just want to, I'm just getting sort of a feel of who my audience is today. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Let me go back to my presentation. So I am just going to get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is the difference between universal design for learning, accessibility, and accommodation. And you often will hear these words thrown around together. Often some people will mistake accommodation for accessibility and vice versa. And so one day because I do this training a lot, I sort of was sitting and I thought, and I'm a very visual person, I'm also a graphic designer. And I was thinking, how can I visually convey this concept? And this image popped into my mind, and so I created it. And so I think of our students, for those of you who are in post-secondary education, but for those of you who are not, think of in terms of the person you want to understand your content, essentially, whatever that content is, a report, a document. I think of them as fish. And our objective with applying all of these concepts is to try and catch as many fish as possible. So when we are providing, again, in the context of education, students with accommodations, we are helping someone with a specific need, an individual need, and we are catching one fish, right? With each of the accommodations we put out, we're catching one fish. So when we decide to apply accessibility guidelines and accessibility practices to our content, our net gets larger and we catch more fish at once. Okay, and then when if we go a step further, we apply universal design for learning concepts, our net gets even larger and we catch even more fish. Okay, so again, our objective is always to try and catch as many fish as possible. I do want to note, though, that there will always be fish outside the net. It is impossible to catch every single fish, right? But we're going to give it our best effort, let's say. Yeah, so that is the concept that sort of came to me, made sense to me. Of course, if anyone has any input around this, I would love to hear it. Don't hesitate to contact me, give me any ideas on how to improve it if something, you know, comes to you about that. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this because today is more about the practical, how do we do it? But the first thing I do want to talk about is the law. So in the context of Ontario, we have a legislation called the AODA, which is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And this is the legislation that governs how we create accessible content. This legislation has 5 accessibility standards, and the one that I focus on in the training I do is information and communications. There are other legislations. There is another one, which is a federal legislation called the ACA, the Accessible Canada Act, I believe it is. But that is for federal regulated bodies and is not as detailed as the AODA. There are 3 important dates, 2 of which have already passed with respect to the AODA. January 2020 was when all print content was meant to be accessible. January 2021 was when all web content was meant to be accessible. And 2025 is when the Ontario government has committed to being fully accessible in all 5 of the accessibility standard areas. So the question then becomes, how do we become AODA compliant when it comes to information and communications? What do we need to do? So there is a set of guidelines. They are called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. You will often hear people refer to it as WCAG. And if you haven't heard it before, you will definitely hear about it in the future. And this set of guidelines are an international web standard guidelines. So what does that mean? That means anyone who is doing anything about accessibility in the world, so the US, Western Europe, some of Eastern Europe, Asia, South America, they are using these guidelines to create their legislation for accessible information and communications. What differs in all of these countries is to what degree they are using this these guidelines in their legislation. So for AODA compliance, we are required to meet what is called WCAG 2.0 level AA standard. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more in the next slide. So currently, there are a number of versions of WAG guidelines. So I actually left one out of this chart. It started with 1.0. Okay. But currently, there is a WCAG 2.0, a WCAG 2.1. So these are already published. WCAG 2.2 was meant to be published in early 2021. Actually, originally, it was meant to be published in November 2020. It got pushed to early November 2021. It still has not been published. There is a working document, however, that people can access, but it's not official yet. It's not an official publication. So I'm not sure when that is going to happen. I suspect COVID affected that. And there is currently a working group to start WCAG 3.0. And, oh, did we press record, Louisa? I hope we did. Oh yeah, we did. Okay, yes, whoever the question, yes, the recording will be available. Yeah. So currently there is a working group for WCAG 3.0, but they have actually dropped the WC off of it. And they're calling it just Accessibility Guidelines 3.0. And they're nicknaming it. So for anyone who plays Trivial Pursuit, here's a piece of information for you. AG is the I don't know what to call it, the symbol, the naming for silver on the periodic table. So they're actually nicknaming it silver. So you might win some Trivial Pursuit question with that. And so there is currently a working group around that. And when the final publication comes out for that is not clear yet. So again, back to our AODA legislation. WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 have 3 levels, A, AA, and AAA. So in order to be AODA compliant, we need to comply with WCAG, any guideline that is a WCAG 2.0, A or AA standard, okay, for AODA legislation. If we comply with AAA, fantastic, but not required legally in Ontario. If we comply with 2.1, fantastic, but again, not legally required, okay? I will say one more thing. All the 2.0 guidelines are included also in the 2.1 guidelines, okay? So the 2.1 have, I forget what the exact number is, but 20 to, or let's say somewhere between 15 and 25 additional standards. That number might be wrong, but so it's those additional ones that we are not legally required to comply with. All right, so that's it about legislation, no more. So I'm going to actually get into the nitty-gritty of how do we create accessible content. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is fonts. Let me make one more note. All of the guidelines and all the suggestions and guidelines that I'm talking about today are either a WCAG 2.0 A or AA standard, or a recommendation from the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. And this is one of those recommendations from the CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. In terms of font, when we want to choose our fonts for our documentation and digital content, we want to use what are called sans serif fonts. So for example, Times New Roman is not a sans serif font. This is called a serif font. Arial, so Times New Roman on the left is a serif font. Arial on the right is a sans serif font. What a serif is are these little extra appendages on your font, these little feet. So in French, sans means without. So essentially we want fonts without feet. That's what we want to choose when it comes to accessibility. So examples, here I have examples of serif fonts on the left. So Times New Roman, Georgia, Minion, for example, are examples of serif fonts, and sans serif fonts on the right. Arial, Verdana, Gotham, Century Gothic. Those are examples of sans serif fonts. The Canadian National Institute for the Blind actually identifies Arial and Verdana as two very accessible fonts. Okay. The next concept I want to talk about is emphasizing text. So when we want to emphasize text in our content, we want to emphasize our text using bold. We do not want to depend on underline, italics, or all caps. And I'm going to take that even a step further, and I'm going to say we never want to underline our content in digital content. Italics and all caps can be used sparingly or minimally. So if you have a word in italics or a few words, that's fine, but we don't want an entire paragraph, for example, in italics or all caps. A heading would be okay in all caps. The reason we do not want to underline is because especially right now with authoring softwares like Microsoft, Word, PowerPoint, Google Docs, any of them, the default for hyperlinks is to underline them. So if we have an underline in our digital content, someone might mistake that for a broken hyperlink. So we don't want to underline. Okay, bold is our best option. The last point here, we do not want to use color by itself, and this part's important, by itself, to differentiate text. Okay, and I'm going to explain more about that in the next coming slides. I see a few questions actually coming in, so let me just quickly scan. Sam, or will I get to font size in the presentation? I actually wasn't going to, but I will mention it now. In terms of font size, the WCAG guidelines state, but it's a 2.1 standard. It's not a 2.0 standard. So again, not legally required, but great if we can do it. 12 points is the minimum that we want to use, let's say in a Word document. There is no specific recommendation or guidelines around PowerPoint documents. And I suspect the reason for that is the very nature of what PowerPoint is used for. PowerPoint is used for presentations, traditionally anyway. So the font size will be acceptable based on the size of my audience, right? So in a situation like this, where I'm presenting from my computer screen and everyone's, close to their computer screens, 16 point might be okay, right? Or if I'm presenting in a small classroom of 30 people, then 20 point might be okay. However, if I'm presenting in an auditorium of 1,000 people, 20 point would be too small, right? So we want to consider the size of our audience when we create PowerPoint presentations. I have a personal rule of thumb. My personal rule of thumb is minimum 20 points for any content that is important that people see. So for example, where I have these things here at the bottom of my screen indicating the guidelines, not as important to my presentation, but some information I would like you to have, that's not 20 points, but appears larger than 20 points. So that's kind of my answer around font size. Are all of those sans serif fonts you've recommended also Unicodes? because it is my understanding that non-Unicode fonts don't play well with screen magnifiers. I actually don't know the answer to that question, Claire. I don't know. I do know that, well, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind does recommend Arial and Verdana. I do know Verdana is used as a web font. So I don't know, take what you can from that answer. Does anyone have suggestions for a font for lower level literacy learners that have an A that is like natural printing? Yeah, that's actually a great point, Lee. And I will go back to that slide for a moment to talk about that. So although Arial and Verdana are considered two very accessible fonts, if we think back to my fish analogy, when we're throwing out our net, if we're using one of these fonts, we catch a lot of fish, but we don't catch all the fish. And I actually had a colleague at my former institution, Humber College, who used to tutor children with dyslexia. And when this one particular child that she was tutoring, when he would see a font with an A like this versus an A like this. So if the font was like this, like a, I don't know what you would call that type of A, but where the A has the overhang on the top, that A would switch with the letter beside it when that child was reading. So she determined he needed a font with the A that looked more like writing, like printing, and then determined which font worked best for that child. So this comes back to the point that we can't catch all fish. These fonts are not going to work for everyone. And then that's where more accommodation type or differentiation of your content and your instruction needs to happen. In terms of recommending a good one, I can't necessarily recommend a good one because, again, everybody is different when it comes to those specifics. The one she found to work for this child, I will say, it was called Chalkboard. So yeah. I've had some colleagues say that they don't bold or italicize any of their text because a screen reader would have to announce that it's bolded, and that can be annoying for learners. Are there any guidelines or thoughts around that? Actually, the screen reader does not announce that formatting in a document. So, so bolding and italics do not get announced by a screen reader. Okay, I think I will move on, or else I I will be here and won't be able to finish my content. So so back to this point, we do not use color by itself to differentiate content. So here in this next slide, I have what am I trying to say? I'm giving you an example. So what you are seeing here is the two sentences on the left that have one word in a different color, and in this case is the color purple, are actually the same as the two sentences on the right. And what the two sentences on the right is happening with the two sentences on the right is I took a screenshot of an app, and I'm going to demonstrate this app to you in the next slide, called Sim Daltonism. And this app is actually simulating for us a form of color blindness called monochromacy. And a person who has monochromacy can only see in black and white. So when this person who has monochromacy sees the two sentences on the left with the different colored word, this is what they see on the right. So if you are asking this person to identify what is different about this sentence, if you give them the one on the top right, or if you give them the top sentence, they will have a very hard time telling you that answer. However, if you give them the sentence on the bottom that uses color and bold, right? The first sentence only uses color. The second sentence uses color and bold. They can still answer that question for you. So back to the previous slide where I said we do not want to use color by itself to differentiate color, to differentiate text. It is okay to use color. Some people get nervous about using color when we start talking about accessibility. It is okay to use color, but the mantra that I use is color and, not color by itself. So color and bold in this case. In the case of a hyperlink, color and underline, right? So color and is the rule, let's say. And you essentially want to ask yourself, does it make sense in black and white, right? If you give your students or someone a document and you have to ask yourself when you give it to them, does it make sense in black and white? And this doesn't just help those with color blindness, that actually also helps maybe your students that don't have a color printer and are printing something in black and white, or for whatever reason, they can only access a black and white screen. So the guideline is you do not use color by itself. That's my little addendum to the guideline, by itself to differentiate text. So the app I was talking about, the Sim Daltonism app, it's wonderful. It's free. It floats over content, which is fantastic. You can float it over a document, over a web page. The only caveat is it only works on a Mac computer, which is what I'm presenting from. There are other options if you are a PC user, and I have a couple listed on the next slide that I'll show you, but I do want to demonstrate this for you because it's quite impactful. So on the screen, I have an image of a set of different colored pencil crayons. And right now, this app is set to what they call normal vision. I really don't like that label, but that's what it is. Normal vision in quotations. And if I click on this little eye icon in the top right corner, a panel opens up that shows me 8 different kinds of color blindness. So I'm going to demonstrate a couple of them for you. The first one I'm going to demonstrate is called deuteranopia, which is a red-green confusion. So if I click on that, where the app covers the image shows you, it simulates what a person with deuteranopia would see when they're looking at this image. The next one I'm going to demonstrate for you is called tritanopia. They're a little hard to pronounce, which is a yellow-blue confusion. So if I click on that, that is a simulation of what a person with tritanopia would see when they're looking at this image. And then the last one I'm going to demonstrate for you is the one that I already showed you, which is monochromacy. So this is what a person with monochromacy would see when they look at this image, right? So if you are asking your student to identify which is the red pencil crayon to this person, and let me give you a more relevant example. Please tell me the equation of the red line, which I have seen on tests that instructors have given. They have a blue line and a red line and tell me the equation of the red line. That student cannot give you the answer, not because they don't understand the content, but because they can't differentiate the colors. And so So not only do we need to be mindful of not only using color to differentiate text, but we also need to be mindful around our language and how we use the language in our instruction. Okay, so that is that. Are there any questions relevant? Louise, I don't know if you, sorry, I forgot to ask you at the beginning, if you wouldn't mind looking at the questions. Were there any questions related, I should say, to this topic?
There's just been some comments in terms of resources shared, so that's been wonderful. And yeah, people sharing some experiences.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on the next slide, I did see someone say, where can I get this tool? I have a slide, and these slides will be available on the ETC website after I update it. So let's say within the next week or two. So I have links that you can actually download as well. So the one I just demonstrated is this first one, Sim Daltonism. There is another great resource, which is a website. So you would have to upload an image to it, but you can also simulate this color blindness on this website. And this last one's really cool, I think. It's actually a web page checker, let's say. So you would put your web page address in here, and it will demonstrate for you what a person with color blindness would see when they're looking at your web page. Okay, next point. So if we, so like I said, color is great to use, right? But we also have to ensure that we have color contrast ratio. So the color contrast ratio between your text and the background, or the color behind your text, needs to be 4.5 to 1 for normal text and 3 to 1 for large text. Large text is considered 14 point bolded or 18 point not bolded. So again, 14 point bolded or 18 point not bolded. So the next logical question would be, well, how do I determine what my color contrast ratio is between my text and my background? And there is an amazing tool developed by the Pacello group. That's how I pronounce it. Some people say Pacello, but I'm Italian. Pacello is how I pronounce it. And this tool is free. Again, floats over your content, which is amazing. And for some reason, it is not opening for me right now. Hold on. Oh, because this thing is in the way. Sorry, I am thinking out loud. Give me a minute. Okay. So here is the tool called the Color Contrast Analyzer by the Pacello group. Again, it's an amazing tool, floats over content. So you can float it over a document or over a website or anything that you want to check, an infographic if you are designing an infographic. For example, that fish diagram that I created, I used this to make sure all my color contrasts were acceptable or compliant. So what you're seeing in this tool is up here at the top. It shows you what your foreground color is, and that would be the color of your text. And then the next box, I guess, shows you your background color, and that would be the color behind your text. Then it shows you a sample. So in this case, it's showing you black text on a white background. It shows you what the contrast ratio of those two colors is. So in this case, 21 to 1, that is the highest contrast ratio you can have. Black and white is the highest. And then down here, it has a number of guidelines, WCAG guidelines. The one we are interested in is this first one, 1.4.3, contrast minimum, AA standard. And if I open that up, It shows you the explanation that I mentioned before, 4.5 to 1 for regular text, 3 to 1 for large text, 18 point bolded, 18 point not bolded, or 14 point bolded is considered large. Then it tells you whether it passes or fails. These other two, again, wonderful if we can comply, not required under AODA legislation, because this one is a AAA standard. And again, you can open that up and it will tell you what that means. And this one here, although it's a AA standard, is actually a 2.1 standard. And that is around UI components, so buttons and things like that. Yeah, so the one we are interested in is this first one. So I'm going to demonstrate using my title of my slide where it says contrast ratio, the blue title against the black background, and I'm going to demonstrate how to use this app. So where it says foreground color, I'm going to click on this little eyedropper tool. And when I do that, you see that this circle opens up. And as I move the circle, the color behind the circle changes. So I'm going to float this over my title and select that color. So when I do that, you'll see it changes in the app, in the color contraster app. And then I'm going to do the same for the background color. So I click that, I go over to the black. Okay, it shows me a sample. And then it shows me the color contrast ratio. And this pair of colors, the blue and the black, the ratio is 4 to 1. And if you look here at the guideline I'm interested in, that tells me that it fails for regular text, but it passes for large text. So what does that mean? That means if I want to use this combination of colors, I have to make sure that I am using it in a large sized text, which means 14 point bolded or larger, or 18 point not bolded or larger. If I want to use this color combination in 12 point, I do not pass this guideline and therefore am not AODA compliant. Okay. So here are some samples. This is actually Seneca's red, the Seneca red. And I just wanted to show you, so the white and the red together is a color contrast of 4.9, and that passes for both regular sized and large text. However, the red and black together is 4.3 and only passes for large size text, does not pass for regular size text. Okay, I think I'm going to start speeding up just a little because I have still a lot I want to talk about. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is hyperlinks. So the first two sentences that I'm showing you, please visit, and then a very long URL for more information, is not accessible. Also, click here for more information about Seneca's teaching and learning is not accessible. You probably have seen a lot of the second example. I have seen most educational institutions use this. It is not accessible. What is accessible is the last sentence. Please visit Seneca's teaching and learning website for more information. So I have this fantastic video, which I'm not going to actually, no, I'm not going to show it today, but I would love it. It's only like a minute and a half, but if you take the time to download the PowerPoint presentation, I would highly recommend watching this video. But I will basically explain what happens in the video. So the reason these two up here are not accessible is, for the first sentence, when a screen reader, and let me define what a screen reader is, for a person who is blind or has low vision, they use a software called screen reader software that reads out content to them so they can listen to it. So this screen reader software, when it comes up against the accessible sentence, will say, please visit link Seneca's teaching and learning website for more information. So it identifies this as a hyperlink to the person who's listening. When it comes up against this first sentence with the long URL, it is unable to identify different words in this URL. So it will say, please visit, and then it will read out each letter of this URL. So by the time it gets to the end, I personally, when I've listened to it a screen reader do this, you would not remember what the URL is any longer, right? And that would be very frustrating to listen to each letter being read out. So that's why that one is not accessible. The second one is not accessible because as a sighted user, let's say I have you know, a 5-page document with 10 URLs, 10 hyperlinks in it, and I read it today, and then the next day I go back to that document and I say, oh, what was that link again for Seneca's teaching and learning site? As a sighted user, I can visually scan this document, and my eye will take me to the piece of content that is visually distinct, right? This underlined, different color hyperlink. So I don't have to reread the 5 pages to find the hyperlink. And so what the screen reader software does for a person who's using it is it wants to give them that same experience, or an approximation of that same experience. So what it gives them the ability to jump between hyperlinks in a document. So if I have click here for all of my hyperlinks, and the person is jumping around the document, all they will hear is link here, link here, link here, with no context about what that URL is about, right? So that's why this is not accessible. So when we're creating hyperlinks, basically what we want to do is we want to use meaningful text on our hyperlinks. We want to avoid generic text like click here, register here, things like that. We want to make the text for each link unique. And I will have an addendum to that statement too, and say unique unless you have 2 links in a document that go to the same place, then they can say the same thing. And we want our links to be visually distinct. So we do not use color by itself to identify a hyperlink. We use color and underline, or color and a symbol in terms of a website, if you don't want to use an underline. Okay, the next topic is images. So images, or rather all non-text content, requires a text alternative. So that could be an image, that could be a pie graph, that could be an infographic. Okay, we need to provide a text alternative, and we can do that in one of 2 ways. We can provide what's called alt text, which is essentially invisible, in quotations, text that we put on an image in our document, that when the screen reader hits that image, it will read out the text that we have assigned to that image. Or we can provide a long, or we can provide a long description. A long description is necessary for complex images, which I will talk about in a couple slides. So When we are describing an image, we want to convey context and function. So what is important about this image? We want to be succinct, so we want it to be short. A screen reader will stop reading after approximately 25 words or 125 characters. So it's got to be short. Context matters. And what I mean by that is the example I like to give, especially in an educational setting, is if I'm looking at this image that I have here on the screen right now of an adorable Chihuahua in a field of dandelions, there are many ways I can describe this image. However, if I am teaching a course on breeds of dogs, then it might be important for me to say Chihuahua in field to identify that it's a Chihuahua. If I'm teaching a course on landscaping, I might not need to identify what kind of dog it is, but maybe it's important for me to identify that it is, you know, natural grass with dandelions, right? So, or maybe I'm doing neither of those things, and it might just be sufficient to say dog in field, right? So context matters, and you as the person providing the image understands what is important about that image. And then we also do not want to use phrases as image of, phrases such as image of or graphic of to describe the image. And the reason we don't want to put in our alt text image of dog in grass or in field. We just want to write dog in field. And the reason for that is because the screen reader is able to identify this piece of content as an image. Exactly, Ahmed. Yes, the screen reader will already mention image of. So when it sees, in quotations, this image, it will say image, dog in field. Surprisingly, though, when it's reading a PowerPoint document, this is another Trivial Pursuit thing. When it's reading a PowerPoint document, it doesn't say image, it says picture, dog in field. But if it's reading a PDF, it says image, dog in field. Yeah, so it's redundant to basically put that in our alt text. So how do we actually add alt text to our images? So if we're using Microsoft products, and usually when you talk about accessibility, you talk about Microsoft products because at the moment, Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint, Microsoft is the leader in terms of creating accessible documents. Google Docs is not is not there, let's say, as Microsoft is. It does have some accessibility features, but it's not as robust as Microsoft. So any training that you do will always be about Microsoft. For now, that could change and probably will change in the future. So anyway, if you are using Microsoft 2019 or later, you will see something like this first box that I'm showing on the left. If you're using 2016 or earlier, I want to say maybe till about 2010, you will see the box I'm showing on the right. So currently on my computer, I have 2019. So I'm the most recent one. So I'm going to demonstrate that for you with this image here. So the way that you add alt text to your image, and it's the same in all Microsoft products, Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, you right click on your image and you go down to edit alt text. They made it very easy for us in 2019 and later. And then this dialog box opens up on the right. And I had shown you the screenshot of that already. And so I would just put in dog in field. Okay, and that's it. That's how you add alt text. if you're using 2019 or later. If you're using an earlier version, 2016 or earlier, you would go about it the same way. You would right click on your image. This option does not exist. Okay, so you have to go down to what's where it says format picture. So you click on format picture. When you do that, this pane opens up on the right with these 4 icons on the top. You would go to the third one, which is size and properties. I believe in the older version it says layout and properties, but it's this third icon. And then down here, there would be an option called alt text. And when you click on that, you get this dialog box that I've given you a screenshot of. Okay, so that's that. Sorry, moving things around. Okay. Now, in terms of complex images, so if we have an infographic, a pie chart, a bar graph, what you want to do is you want to use what I call general alt text on the image, so on the graph, and then provide a long description for that graph. So for example, the general alt text I might use on this bar graph here that I have on the slide is bar graph titled birthday of students by month. And then in a long description, I would explain what is important about this graph. And what I want the person reading my document to know about this graph. Because it would be very hard to describe this in less than 25 words. So that's why we want to provide a long description. We also want to remember that we do not use color as the only way of conveying our information, right? So we want to use texture, line style, text, different shades. Those are some examples of things you can use. So if I go to this sample or example here, the line graph on the left is inaccessible because color is the only way that I can identify the content. However, the graph on the right is accessible because in addition to color, they are using line styles, they're using labels, line styles and labels. So, and this goes back to, if I use my color blindness simulator and I ask myself the question, does it make sense in black and white? If I ask the person looking at these graphs to answer the question, what percentage of users were using a Macintosh computer in 2001? If you look at the graph on the left, you can't answer that question, right? But if you look at it on the right, you can answer that question. And so again, imperative that we ask ourselves, does it make sense in black and white? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip the Menti exercise, but I just am going to tell you what I wanted you to get out of it. So for this pie graph here, and these are all examples that I've pulled off the web, so they exist in the Ethernet and the internet. This example from the Environmental Protection Agency website shows a pie graph that is inaccessible. And again, the reason it's inaccessible is because color is the only way that I'm able to identify this content. So it's actually quite an easy fix to make this accessible. If I, next to, in the legend, put the percentages right here, right? So I write thermoelectric power dash 45%, irrigation dash 32%, right? Then the graph is accessible because I have more than one way to identify the content. In this example of this line graph, this is not accessible again because color is the only way I can identify the content. And then so in order to make it accessible, what I could do is I can add symbols, right? So triangles for this one, maybe squares here, X's here, right? And that becomes accessible. This you might think is accessible because they're always stacked in the same way. However, and I'd actually really love if the example to be a little different. You'll see this last one, it's actually missing. It only has 3 chunks and not 5 like the rest of them, right? It would be entirely possible that this could be D or F, right? We don't know. Just by looking at it in black and white, what it is. It could be F, right? So that is not accessible. So a way to make this accessible would be to put different textures, perhaps, or labeling, like actually put the A's, like actually put A, right? The labels on it. So we can either use labels or we can use textures for this. This one is actually accessible. I will point out though that these 2 colors are a little light, but that is a 2.1 standard actually, so technically AODA compliant, but I would make those darker. And then the last image here I have is of 3 pie charts. What I will say as someone who is a graphic designer, I would never create them like this because they aren't visually pleasing. But from the perspective of accessibility, the first 2 are accessible because there's more than one way to identify content. And the third one is not accessible because color is the only way that I can identify the content. And that is it. I am done my presentation. It is 12:01. If anyone has any questions at any point, you are free to contact me, email me, LinkedIn me. Don't tweet at me because I don't check that as much, but you're welcome to, follow me on Twitter if you want. I'm happy to stay back a few minutes if anyone wants to do that and ask any questions, because I know I didn't really get to everyone's questions. But if you are unable to do that, you are free to go. So if anyone does have a question, feel free to put up your hand and come on the microphone if you want. It'll be hard to go back in the chat and see the questions again.